Welcome to the Benzo Free Podcast, your home for an honest, straightforward, and personal discussion about anti-anxiety drugs, their effects, and how to deal with dependence and withdrawal. Whether you have taken benzodiazepines, Z drugs, or any other tranquilizers, know someone who has, or you just want help dealing with chronic anxiety and insomnia, this is your podcast. I'm your host, D.E. Foster, author of the book, Benzo Free, The World of Anti-Anxiety Drugs and the Reality of Withdrawal. I'm so glad you joined us today. Please stick around and let me bend your ear for a few minutes. You just might feel a little better on the other side.
Hello there, this is D, and welcome to episode 45 of the Benzo Free Podcast. Today's feature is a conversation with Dr. Christy Huff. And if you'd like to skip directly to that conversation, don't forget there is an episode index at the top of our show notes to make that a little bit easier for you. Do you ever wonder that the anxiety itself may not be the only problem? But on top of all that, there's also the anxiety of the anxiety that is making things almost unbearable. Do you ever have fear of having fear of something? Are you anxious of being anxious in some situations? Or that the anxiety you feel long before an event triggers your symptoms even before you left home? The fear of the fear or the anxiety of having anxiety may sound redundant, but I think they are a lot more common than we realize. Some of you, I know, are already saying yes, now aren't you? You know what I'm talking about, don't you? Let me share a hypothetical example with you. You finally get up the nerve to go out to dinner with some friends. And you recall that the last time you went out to dinner, several months before your last wave, things didn't go well. You got anxious. You felt like you were trapped, like you were a caged animal. You even felt like everyone was watching you and judging you. You got jittery, restless, and your skin started to burn or itch, and you became extremely sensitive to the light and sounds around you, or perhaps you couldn't make a decision on what to order, and you got confused, and you had to run for the shelter of the restroom. And now, this event has become a thing. This embarrassing, stressful, frightening event is now stored eternally in your memory. Enough so that you never want to go out to dinner again. Even though your friends didn't really notice anything and tell you it was no big deal, to you, it was monumental and has created a new trigger deep inside you, so much that even the mention of going out to dinner causes a cascade of symptoms. But now you've been invited out to dinner by your partner's boss, and you really can't say no. It's still a week away, but every day the dread fills your mind and the symptoms increase, and you feel ridiculous. You've eaten out before. You used to do it all the time before benzos, but this time you just can't get past it. And now you're jittery, restless, hypersensitive, sleepless, and the burning skin or itchy skin or mass confusion has all returned. The bizarre thing is, you know it's not that big of a deal, but you can't get past it. This reaction isn't caused by the anxiety of the moment or the original fear. It's caused by the expectation, the fear of the fear, or the anxiety of the anxiety. You are afraid of being anxious and what being anxious will result in. You are still at home, comfortable, safe, and yet the thought of what this experience might be has already triggered a significant wave. Now, if you feel you are the only one who has experienced this, don't worry, you're not. Many of us experience this type of event in benzo withdrawal. I'm an old pro at this practice. In fact, I think I'm a time-tested veteran, if you want to call it that. I can even get worked up about the fear of the fear of the fear. The dreaded triple threat. Don't even try to get me to explain that one. I'm sharing this with you today as a reminder. The majority of our symptoms are triggered by fear, stress, and anxiety, or at least escalated by these emotions. So that's why I talk so much about working on tools to manage those three things. You know, I still do this more often than I would like, but the good news is I recognize the pattern most of the time, and I have tools to help ease its effects. Most of the time I can talk myself down and push through and do the event anyway. It's not easy, but I know that it will get easier the more I do it. But you know what? It's also okay to say no. That it's too much for you now. That you're going to do this when you feel better, but right now is not the time. You know, if you are getting these double-decker fears or even triple-decker ones, you're in good company, and it's okay. You will work through them. It's okay just to say, I'm anxious. It's just anxiety. It will come and it will go. And the less you try and fight it, the sooner it will start to ease. You're going to be okay. And you're going to get through this. Anyway, thanks for listening to me ramble again. I appreciate it. But now I've got to run. I have a show to do. And no, I'm not anxious about it. You know, I was at the beginning, but I'm not anymore. In fact, I look forward to recording this podcast each week. The anxiety of recording a podcast, or even the anxiety of recording a podcast, is gone. In part because I've done it a few times, more than a few times, and I know now that the fears were ill-founded. But most of all, I don't have the anxiety because I'm talking to you. I know you, and I know you understand me and what I'm going through. Thanks for that. Today we have a slightly altered format again, which will include our introduction, Benzo Story, and feature. But we will drop our mailbag today due to time constraints. Last week we had included our mailbag and not our Benzo Story. This week it's the reverse. Confused? Yeah, me too. Oh well. Our feature today is conversation with Dr. Christy Huff, and this is part 2 of our 2-part interview with the doctor. And before we move on, I do want to remind you that we still need feedback. As always, questions, comments, stories, suggestions, corrections, additions. This is your podcast, and the more content I can share from you, the more Benzo-Free becomes a community it was designed to be. Visit our feedback form at benzofree.org/feedback or email us at podcast@benzofree.org. You can also comment directly on the podcast blog post itself for others to see. And don't forget to sign up for our mailing list at benzofree.org/subscribe. And one last thing, the Benzo Free podcast is for informational purposes only and should never be considered medical advice. If you're listening to this podcast on one of our providers, please leave feedback on that carrier. This helps new listeners find us. Okay, let's move on to our Benzo Story. Today's story is from Heather in Minnesota. Heather writes, "Thank you so much for this podcast. It helps me every day. On bad mornings, I listen to episodes just to get out of bed. It just helps to hear the voice of someone who understands. I was prescribed 1 milligram of Ativan a year and a half ago when my mother died. 6 months in, my doctor increased it to 2 milligrams a day. I had no idea it was addictive or how hard it would be to stop taking the drugs. 3 months ago, when I tried to stop taking them, I was hit with the most spectacular and bizarre symptoms. Smell intolerance, light and sound intolerance, vertigo, and flu-like symptoms. I was a mess. I went to another doctor and told him I needed help. I feared the first doctor would cut me off if he knew my symptoms. Luckily, the second doctor knew a lot about benzo withdrawal and helped me put together a taper plan. I have been tapering for 3 months and am down to 1 milligram a day. I am so angry. I just want off this evil medication, and I want to sue the doctor who prescribed it without explaining the side effects. It should be a law, like reading someone their Miranda rights, that doctors explain the withdrawal symptoms of benzos before prescribing them. But for now, I can't let myself get too angry at the why this happened and who to blame. Right now, I have to focus on positivity and progress. I am in the middle of withdrawal and struggling to work, but have found that working, exercising, and seeing friends in low-stress situations is the best thing for me. Right now, I am trying like hell to stay patient. I'm wondering how my last dose should be when I jump off completely. I know everyone is different, but is there any data or statistics on what dose people try to jump off? I've heard 0.5 milligrams, but wonder if some people go lower. Thanks so much, and keep up the great work. Thank you, Heather. Thank you so much for sharing your story on the podcast. I completely understand your anger, frustration, and even hopelessness that this situation causes. And getting mad at those who did this to you is absolutely natural, and you have every right to feel that way. You are right that now is probably not the best time for anger. Anger is not a friend of healing and recovery, and I'm glad that you are putting it aside for now so you can focus on getting better. Of course, that can be easier said than done. As for having a law that requires doctors to warn us about these drugs, that would be what we call informed consent legislation. And there are several U.S. states working on that type of requirement right now, with Massachusetts leading the way. I'm involved with a team here in Colorado doing similar work. I'll put a link in our show notes with more info for those who are interested. In episode 42 of our podcast, which was part 2 of our series titled How to Taper from Benzos, I shared the last part of Heather's story, and we discussed how to determine when to jump from your last dose during your taper. Check out that episode if you want to learn more. 0.5 milligrams of diazepam, or Valium, is a very common jumping point, and Ashton even mentions that in her manual. One thing to keep in mind is that Ashton is referring to 0.5 milligrams of diazepam, or Valium, and not lorazepam, or Ativan. If you are tapering directly from lorazepam and you jumped from 0.5 milligrams, that would be equivalent to 5 milligrams of diazepam, since lorazepam is 10 times as potent as diazepam. And that would be a large jump at the end. Thus, according to the Ashton manual, it might be best to continue your taper down to 0.1 milligrams of lorazepam before you jump. But like I said many times, that is a decision between you and your doctor, and I'm not providing any medical advice here at all. Thanks so much for sharing your story with us today, and I wish you the best with your taper. And please continue to focus on positivity and progress. You're doing great, and I'm sure you will be successful. Keep in touch. Thanks, Heather. And don't forget, we still need stories. Just go to our feedback form at benzofree.org/feedback to share your story, or send an email to podcast@benzofree.org. And now, on to our feature. Today, our feature is a conversation with Dr. Christy Huff. This is part 2 of our 2-part conversation with Dr. Huff. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I advise you to go back and listen to that first. It will make a lot more sense. In part 2 of our conversation, Dr. Huff speaks about finding a doctor, her work with benzo advocacy, reporting adverse drug effects to the FDA, and so much more. I shared Dr. Huff's bio in part 1, so if you want to hear that, please listen to that episode first. And now, without further delay, Let's join our conversation already in progress. One of the things I face a lot with, you always have this disclaimer on there to work with your doctor and to make sure you taper under doctor supervision. And it's like, well, I can't find a doctor or my doctor won't help me. What advice do you give? I know you talk to a lot of people in the benzo community. I've corresponded with so many. I get a lot of people on my show who say, well, I've been in a group with Dr. Huff, or I've talked to Dr. Huff, or she's emailed me. So you do amazing work. What do you tell to those patients who can't find a doctor to work with?
Right. Well, that's difficult. I mean, I know from working at BIC, we have people writing in all the time looking for a doctor, and we do keep a list of benzo-wise doctors, but it's
Yeah.
by no means adequate. So, I always tell people at least try to look for somebody. You do need somebody that's going to supervise you and renew your prescription.
Yeah.
I will say that you don't need a doctor that's 100% benzo wise to run your taper. You just need somebody that's going to follow you and let you taper at your own pace, um, and take as long as you need, basically. So I think some people are just looking for that perfect doctor who knows everything about benzos, and you're just not going to find that.
Right. I love that you said that. I try to always remind people that it's more important to have a doctor who will believe you, work with you.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, in my own situation, it took me a while myself. So I completely empathize. I went to a couple of different doctors. The
Mm-hmm.
initial prescriber basically told me, you're not dependent on the medication. You
Yeah.
just are a
Mine
basket
too.
case.
Mine too.
Right. You have anxiety. You're crazy.
Yeah.
And then I went to I got desperate. I went to some random psychiatrist, that, and she gave me a whole bunch of other medications, which I didn't take, but she also implied I was crazy, said it wasn't the Xanax. Um, so on my third attempt, I found a psychiatrist, and he had never heard of the Ashton Manual, but I brought it in
Yep.
with me, and he listened to me and he believed me. And that was that. So he helped me switch from Xanax to Valium. And, he made suggestions about dose reductions, but he let me take as long as I needed, and
Yeah.
that was what I needed. So, if you can find somebody like that, that's ideal.
I had similar experience. I went to a few different ones and then went back to a doctor I used to go to in the mountains. And he said, you don't need to come off this. But I said, I want to. Will you work with me? He said, yes, I will work with you. And he actually made me wait 6 months to taper, which I hated because, I just wanted to get these damn things out of my system.
Right.
But then, of course, in hindsight, I look back, I'm going, man, he was brilliant because my mental state was crap at that time.
Right.
And I probably wouldn't have made it. And he knew that. And he said, go work on develop tools. So I went and started meditation. I started yoga. I exercised. I got myself calm and understood and researched and read the action manual again and,
Hmm.
and did what I could. And then I came back and he said, okay, now you're ready. And then he worked with me every step of the way. Even though
Right.
he didn't believe maybe that we had to withdraw from benzos, he still worked with me.
Right. And that's what you need, somebody who's going to listen to you and
Yeah.
work with you and be responsive. If you develop symptoms and we need to slow down and be responsive to your needs. I will say also that there's probably a decent proportion of the benzo community that are tapering without their doctor's knowledge.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm not gonna I can't officially recommend that. I'm just telling you that's what happens
I
in
know.
practice because they're afraid of how their doctor is going to react, um, if they
Yeah.
find out they're tapering.
I agree, and I'm in the same boat. I can never recommend for somebody to taper without doctor supervision, and I also
Exactly.
agree with it for the same reasons we were just talking about. Not only do you need somebody to develop the proper dosages, to prescribe the proper dosages, but we have so many problems, like we were talking about with the chest pains and different things. Well, who are you going to go to with those problems? It's good to have somebody you can go to and say, hey, I'm feeling this. You know what I'm going through. Do you think this is this or not? And they can test and work with you.
Right.
Yeah, the nurse practitioner I go to now, she was prescribing benzos, regularly. And this is one thing I try to remind people all the time is that She now, because I've been her patient for several years, is very restrictive in her prescribing now. She's
Hmm.
changed her prescribing practices along with two other doctors I've been to because I was their patient.
Oh, that's great.
And I think that's a great way for us to help start make a difference. If you go to the doctor and can't have one that actually listens to you, and that's the key thing, somebody who will listen to you and work with you.
Right.
But by seeing what you go through, I think sometimes that's the best message or the best way we can actually start to make this difference.
Right. And that actually made me think of one other thing. So when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I was in the middle of that Valium taper, I was
Hmm.
terrified about how I was going to explain to all these other new physicians about what was going on with me. And so I had my psychiatrist that was running my taper, I had him write me a letter. And he basically just said, Christy's been on this Valium taper for a few months now, and she's never abused the drug. She's very sensitive withdrawal symptoms. And, he even said, let her take her own generic dose of medication into the hospital and, to make
Yeah.
sure she stays on track with her taper. And so I thought that was a really good way for me to explain to my other physicians because I
Oh,
had him
yeah.
advocating for me.
I think that's a great idea. And it's, and you're a physician yourself, but physicians sometimes do listen more to their peers
Right.
sometimes than they
They
do to
do,
the
but
patients.
I've got to tell you, when I've been explaining this
Hmm.
benzo debacle to other healthcare professionals, that are taking care of me, they sort of get this look on their face, like I'm coming from outer space. So
Really? Doesn't make any
so
difference, huh?
yeah, so that it does to an extent, but
Okay.
there's still, being a woman is another
Okay.
whole nother issue of
Yeah.
you're not quite taken quite as seriously. So I felt better just having that letter so they could read it and say, hey, this is a real thing.
Understand. Let's morph a little bit into the being a benzo advocate and organizer as you've been for a while now.
Sure.
Let's talk about Benzodiazepine Information Coalition. You are on the board of directors for Benzodiazepine Information Coalition, or BIC or BIC. I don't know what you guys prefer. I do know that there's no the before it.
That is right. Yeah, we vacillate, but I call it BIC. I think
Okay.
Janice calls it BIC, so we
Yeah.
just go back and forth.
Yeah, I think when I first talked to Janice, it was kind of, I started talking about BIC by saying the Benzodiazepine Information Coalition. She said,
Right.
that's not quite right.
There's no
And I
the.
think Nicole wrote me back too and said, hey, we prefer it to be this. And it's like, okay. How did you get involved with BIC? How did that start for you?
Yeah, so they were born in August of 2016, and they approached me a couple of months later. I believe it was October, and I had just had my second, or maybe it was right after my first cancer surgery.
Okay.
They approached me about writing a letter about my experience with benzodiazepine withdrawal since I was a physician.
Hmm.
And so I wrote a blog for the website. And so that opened up the relationship. And I became involved in their Facebook group, which was called BELA at the time, Benzodiazepine Awareness and Legal Action, I believe.
Okay. Interesting.
Uh, and so, they would post things about getting involved in advocacy and things like that. And they approached me in April of, I think, 2017. One of their other directors stepped down because you always need three, so they needed a third director, and so I stepped in, and the rest is history.
Oh, great. So maybe you can help explain a little bit to our audience what is BIC's vision or philosophy, and what primary areas is your organization working on?
Sure. So our mission statement is that we educate about the adverse effects of prescribed benzodiazepines. And what we're really about is advocating for that group of patients who were harmed by these drugs, experienced neurological damage just by taking them as prescribed. And we really have a multi-pronged approach to this. I mean, first of all, we have our website, which is a great resource.
Hmm.
We publish blog content fairly regularly. There's a list of resources, including the Ashton Manual.
Yes, and the new versions of it that you work.
Yes, we released a new version. Janice and Nicole worked really hard on that.
Yeah, that's great.
There's a PDF version on our website and also a Nook and a Kindle version that's available
Oh,
on
great.
Amazon. Yeah. And so we're also interested in dealing with the media. So we get
Hmm.
a number of media interview requests. We actually participated very strongly in the recent Lisa Ling episode that
Yeah.
was on CNN.
How did that come
Uh,
together?
yeah, so they ended up approaching us. I forget exactly how that happened, but Brooke Monk, who's on our advisory board, general advisory board, that's really her strong point
Hmm.
is dealing with the media and organizing things. So she did a really great job of working with them and finding them patients to be interviewed and
Yeah.
helping out finding some of those videos that were shown. So, and you can see that we both Brooke and BIC got mentioned in the credits at the end.
Okay, great.
So that was exciting.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That took I thought I heard something like that took almost a year to put together.
It did. It took, yeah, it's been about a year
Wow.
because Chrissy was still tapering, and she and I actually jumped, I think, a day apart on our tapers. So
And she was in the program.
she was in yeah, she was the second patient that they showed.
Right. Oh, that's great. Yeah, I know it's people I think don't always understand what it takes to go into that level of an interview for a national broadcast. So,
Right. I can imagine it was I think they filmed her for a couple of days if I recall.
yeah.
I mean, I know that when I was filmed for the NBC News a couple of years back, and they they filmed me for 4 hours, and I was just on for like a
Oh
minute and a
no.
half, something like that. But they told me that going in that we're gonna film and film, and then when you see the actual news spot, you're gonna be like, where is all that footage?
I have to admit that's when I first learned of BIC. I was watching the news one night, and which back when I watched news, which I don't do much of anymore, but and you were on there, and I was blown away to see somebody on a national news program talk about this problem. And it just, I mean, I honestly broke down and started crying when I saw your interview. Be-
Oh, that's amazing that you found me that way.
well, yeah, because it was just one of those things that, it's that validation that we're so many of us are so desperately seeking to say, yes, this is real. I'm experiencing it. Why won't you pay
Right.
attention to me?
Exactly. And that's why I did it. The only thing we were sad about that episode because there was so much addiction talk, you
I
know.
know there was, yeah. But that's hard. That's hard to battle. We kind of are going to face that no matter where we go, and we just have to work with it, I
Right.
think, and work around
And
it. But
that's what BIC is constantly dealing with in the media. And we're very upfront whenever we have a media request. We talk about the addiction versus dependence up front and say,
yeah,
hey, are you talking about addiction or are you talking about dependence? And
good.
we educate them, and like we're not going to provide you patients if this is going to be a story about addiction.
Yeah,
So we're very we're sticklers for that because it's important.
it is important. I was just yesterday morning I was at a health summit here in Denver, at Denver University, and Dr. Wright was speaking.
Hmm.
And one of the things I love that he does is he gets invited a lot of places to speak on opioids. And when he gets invited, he says, "Yes, but I'd like to do a program on benzos too." And I thought that's nice. So he had an opioid part he was talking on, then was also talking on benzos that morning, and I went and attended both of those.
Hmm.
And I like that, certain physicians like yourself and him and others are making that clear differentiation between addiction and dependence. And saying that up front, I think is become a big help for so many of us. It's just going to take time, I think, for it to
Right, I
permeate
agree.
through the medical community.
Right. Well, it's interesting because the FDA just put out a document. It was a draft document. They were asking for feedback,
Okay.
and it was talking about drug labeling and how they were going to make the distinction between addiction and dependence and define those terms and define tolerance and withdrawal. And BIC was able to actually, it was public. Anybody could provide feedback, so we were able to provide feedback for that. I haven't seen the aftermath of that yet,
Okay, that's
but
great.
that should be coming into play on as far as labeling. But the FDA is
Yeah.
slow. We'll see how long that takes.
Well, and speaking of the FDA, I noticed the new link on BIC's website, reported injury.
Mm-hmm.
And can you explain to the listeners what that is and why that's so important?
Sure. Well, first of all, that link has always been there, but Janice
Okay.
may have moved it
I
potentially.
think maybe, yeah, it's now on the top on the upper right, and it kind of highlighted, so it stuck out at me. I just hadn't seen it before, maybe.
Right. Yeah, I think it kind of moves from time to time because we have to play with the website to see if we can get maximal
Yeah.
interaction or, be more user friendly or whatnot. But so that's, if you click on that, it will take you to a link for the FDA MedWatch program, and that's where you can go and report any adverse effect you've had to any prescription drug. And it's a really important thing to do because what they keep is this huge database of
Mm-hmm.
information about these drugs. And, if there's any patterns that they're seeing, that will be flagged and potentially further investigated. And the other thing is, even if that doesn't occur, at some point, we're going to reapproach the FDA about stronger warning labels
Right.
on these drugs, and they can go back and look in that database full of information and, figure out some of these patterns that are going on. So I encourage, a lot of people ask what they can do for the benzo advocacy cause,
Mm-hmm.
what they can do to spread awareness. That's the first thing that we tell people to do, is to file one of these reports. And I'll say they're not too complicated to fill out. Some people are worried about,
Okay.
is their information safe? It's like, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
you actually don't have to even use your name. Um, it can be anonymous,
Okay, good.
and I know some people are cognitively impaired and have problems filing the report, and we're always available at BIC to help. If somebody, I'm pretty familiar with the form. I've actually helped quite a few people file their forms, so
Okay.
I'll be glad to help if people just want to contact me, or we can
Oh,
find
great.
somebody to help.
Speaking of that, you also were involved with Jay McCoubry on the survey, right? That was handled through BIC.
Yes.
How did that go, and how's that going?
Yes. So I believe it was about a year ago, Jane designed a survey to be given to the benzodiazepine withdrawal community. It was shared on Benzo Buddies and the Facebook groups and some other outside groups that dealt with mental health or anxiety. And the survey was meant to assess benzodiazepine withdrawal symptoms and how long they last, and also, more importantly, the life impact these things are happening. So we have some very preliminary data analysis
Okay.
done. I think we need to do some further data analysis as far
Oh,
as
good.
splitting these into groups. And eventually, the plan is to publish some scientific papers.
Okay. That's great. That sounds great. Yeah, I think getting the information out there. One of the things I noticed in one of your blog articles was you referenced two governmental articles that I had referenced too, and one was from the state of Pennsylvania and one was from New York City.
Hmm.
I researched both those for my book also, and I was so glad to see those in your article too. And it's amazing to see that in a publication for like the state of Pennsylvania or for like the city, the largest city in the United States, New York City. The information's out there, but when such a public health department releases it, we get so frustrated in the community as lay people. Why don't the doctors know this?
Right, I agree. I think part of it is just because those are, right now, we don't have any standardized benzo prescribing or tapering guidelines. It's all very
Right.
regional or local documents that have been published. So it's like those are only touching those communities. So we definitely need to get recommendations that are more widespread. The New York City and the Pennsylvania guidelines are both really great. I think as far as prescribing guidelines, but they don't touch as much on safe tapering.
No, they're more
That's
just.
something that's really lacking.
You're right. They're more just covered the awareness that they should not be prescribed long term, but they don't
Right.
really tell us how to withdraw. And that seems to where we wind up back on the Ashton Manual again as being the only really published document that covers that. And
Exactly.
It's now a decade, 2 decades old, depending on which version you're looking at. So
It is, and then unfortunately, at least here in the U.S., many doctors aren't aware of it. I don't know if it's because it was done in the U.K. and they just don't put any stock in that because it's from another country. I'm not really sure, but
I'm not either, because it is amazing how many have never heard of it, and you mention it, and usually the
right.
physician rolls their eyes at you, like
Yeah, I mean, I can say that I never heard about it in my training.
Right.
I mean, you'll come across a doctor rarely that knows exactly what it is, and it's usually just because they've had a patient that they had a difficult time tapering them off benzos, and that's how they learned.
Exactly, and that's like we talked about earlier. That seems to be that's a way I think people in the community are making a difference, is just by being a patient in benzo withdrawal and working with a physician. I do think that's making a difference for a lot of people. A lot of people I talk to say, my physician wasn't on board at first, but now she is, or
Right,
something like
right.
that. And it's becoming think about the number of people that change just helped out. How many other
Exactly.
patients is that physician now helping? And who else is that physician telling? That can really spread. That can make a difference, in my opinion.
Oh, I definitely agree.
Um, we're going to start wrapping this up here. And
Sure.
I appreciate your time. You've been very generous with it. You've been interviewed by many organizations about your experience with benzo withdrawal. Is there a specific question that you have not been asked, or covered a topic that you'd like to talk about or answer?
Sure. I feel like when I'm interviewed, a lot of the times I'm actually, depends on who I'm being interviewed by, but if it's somebody outside benzo world, then I'm actually doing a lot of educating.
Okay.
Um, so, beyond them asking me questions, I'm also educating about addiction versus dependence, and also the potential for neurological damage from these drugs. And that's something that, when the media is coming to us, they're always thinking in terms of addiction and overprescribing, but
Yeah.
really the neurological damage and physical dependence, that's not really on their radar.
Okay.
So I do wish that was being more covered in the media, just how difficult the withdrawal can be and how severely
Yeah.
some of the patients are affected. I mean, people are 100% disabled from this. Um,
It's amazing. I think that's I come back to the term that I heard during my recovery, which is ineffable, and I didn't even know what it meant. I had to look it up, but it's something that we cannot explain. We can't.
right.
It's you hear people that say, who are Vietnam War vets, who say you just don't know unless you've been there. And that's
Exactly.
exactly, I think, how benzo withdrawal feels to a lot of us. It's like we can't explain this. It takes so long. It's so debilitating at times for some people, and it just carries on, and your life changes. I mean, you've experienced so many life changes, I know, through your experience.
Yes, I have. And you're right. It is so very hard to explain. Like when you were having me explain earlier, like what my mornings were like, what my withdrawal symptoms were like. And it's like, yeah, there's just there's not enough words for it.
There aren't, and I noticed that when I interviewed my wife on the podcast. As she wrote a chapter in my book for the caregiver, and
Hmm.
so I interviewed her one time, and one of the things we came up several times was, as much as she went through with me for the last 6 years of my withdrawal plus the other 12 years on the drug, she still never knows exactly what it's like. And she's the one that told me that. She said, I sometimes forget you're still going through it. I sometimes forget that. And then I see you get up and have to go run, or I see you with your hand on the side of your face because of the spiders, or I see you and it's like, and I'm reminded, oh, yeah, you're still going through this.
Right, right. I know. And a lot of this isn't visible. So it makes it hard. But yeah, I think my husband's been the same. It's like, I don't complain about my symptoms as much
Exactly.
anymore because first because I'm doing a little better, and second because, like, you get tired of complaining.
You
Um,
do. And do you feel like I use the term of bar was lowered, and I don't mean this in a negative aspect, but do you feel like after you've been so low, like the days when you were bedridden, couldn't get out of the house, and had to try to get your daughter ready, and now things are improved, I try to relate to people that life looks pretty good right now because of where I've been.
yeah. Oh, definitely,
Do you feel
definitely.
that way?
I do. I'm still a little bit. I'm not quite as far out as you are, so
Okay, yeah.
I'm still having some rough days here and there.
Oh, I'm sure.
But it's definitely it's. I still have to remind myself, like, okay, look back to this time at the end of your taper when you were just literally felt like you were dying and couldn't get out of the bed. Like you're doing so much better. So even though I still feel pretty bad on some days, you're right, it is all relative. So, but I'm still in I guess, the phase where I have to remind myself how far I've come.
Exactly. And I get that a lot, and I talk to a lot of people that are always struggling with that aspect. And I don't know if you get this a lot, but I get a lot of people that ask me, when will I be 100% healed?
Mhm.
Well, of course,
Yes, I get that all the time.
yeah, there is still, and we have to be honest, there is that chance that some of this stuff is permanent, even though most studies have shown that you do heal over time. It just can take a really long time. But we don't know that 100% for sure
Right.
with science. But you are healing, I am healing, and it makes sense that we would continue that path. Is what I try to let them know. But I also try to let them know that I am not the same person I was before. I have some limitations now in my life and some difficulties, but I am actually better in many ways because of what I've gone through and what I was forced to learn.
Oh, I mean, it's definitely true. I mean, this is life changing, and I won't ever be the same. I
Yeah.
I definitely have a different perspective on suffering, and you know, every time I'm finally just able to experience some joy again, and just do some normal things like go shopping, or I
Oh,
don't
I
take any of
know.
that for granted anymore.
I don't either. I go to the grocery store probably 4 or 5 times a week in the morning, and I will get an herbal tea at Starbucks while I'm there, and I'll do my little shopping and come home. And it was the one thing I could keep doing most of the time during my taper and withdrawal. And now I enjoy it. It's become. I mean, I like to go to the grocery store, and
Right.
it sounds so small, but that's an amazing thing for me right now.
Right. No, it is. It is.
It's a different perspective that we have.
Yeah, and I just it's almost like awakening from the dead, and
Yes,
it's been this very weird experience. Like there's things I didn't do for 4 years, and it's like
exactly.
I'm seeing the world again for the first time. Like, I do sewing and crafts, and within just the past couple of weeks, I felt well enough to go in there and try to sew something. So I sewed my daughter a skirt,
Uh huh.
and but I hadn't, these things were covered with dust. I hadn't touched them in 4 years. I mean, it's like life just stopped in a way. I feel like Rip Van Winkle, and I just woke up, and now I'm trying to get back to life, and it's
And,
it's
and
just
it's a slow
weird.
process, yeah. And we
It
have to
is.
take it one step at a time. But oh, that's amazing. Do you have any last question? Do we have any words of encouragement for the people who are out there, either just learning about their dependence, starting their taper, or even like myself in protracted withdrawal for some months or years? What have you learned that you would like to pass on to those people?
Sure. So I would say for people that are still in the thick of things, if you're still tapering, definitely go slowly and listen to your body. There's no one size fits all approach for everybody on the taper. Just find
Mm-hmm.
out what works best for you. You're going to have a lot of patience, and I'm speaking to myself too because I'm still in the middle of the healing process. Like, for some of this can just be a long process, but you have to trust it, that things aren't always going to be this bad. And I keep holding on to hope that I'm going to continue to get better and better. And there were times during my taper that it was so bad that I couldn't see the future. I just wanted to die. And I finally
Yeah.
gotten to the point on the other side where it's like hey, I'm glad I did this. I'm glad I survived. So just know that you're going to get there too. And then, other advice I have is, lots of distraction.
Mm-hmm.
I distracted myself a lot during the taper. There were times I could do nothing but sit around and watch Netflix, but I know people are painting those the W Bad Rocks of Kindness, and I
Yes,
think
those are great.
those are really cool. And maybe now that I'm able to do more crafts and things like that, I can participate in that. My last piece of advice would be to find a small group of fellow benzo sufferers that can help support you through this, even if it's just online or via, text or phone calls. I ended up actually, I was on the internet forums for a while, but then they got to be too overwhelming for me. So I
Yeah.
just ended up making friends through the forums, and I had maybe like 4 or 5 people, and we would just, talk or
That's
text,
perfect.
and we still talk to this day, and it just really helped all of us
Oh,
through.
good. Yeah, I've actually I've had a couple people written into me who have been part of your group and have said how much that has really helped them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a great idea for people to do that, is find some friends. You can meet them. A discussion group, you're right, it's a great place to meet them. But then form your own support group offline, and go with the people that you can trust and can talk to. It can help. You can share your experiences and learn from each other. I think that's a great idea. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I just have to say, Dr. Huff, thank you so much for being on our show today. I really enjoyed talking with you. I think this has so much good information for the people out there who are still struggling and are looking for feedback. But before I let you go, I want to remind people to please visit BIC's website at benzoinfo.com or their Facebook page at facebook.com/BZInfoCoalition. And also, they can email you too. Is that okay? Can they find their information on that website?
Yes, my email's under my profile on the website.
Thank you so much. That's great.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, mine too. So, well, we'll sign off now, and you have a great day.
All right, you too, Dee.
All right, bye-bye. And that closes out part 2 of our interview with Dr. Christy Huff. Thanks so much to Dr. Huff for her time and dedication to raising awareness about benzos. She is a true asset to our community in the best sense of the word. We really appreciate all you do. And before we move on to our moment of peace, please allow just 30 seconds for our disclaimer.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice in any way. The host of this podcast is not a medical professional, nor is he engaged in rendering medical, health, or psychological advice, nor any other kind of personal or professional services. The views and opinions expressed by our listeners and interview guests on this podcast, whether read from textual submissions or presented in their own voice, do not necessarily reflect those of the Benzo Free podcast or of its host. Withdrawal, tapering, or any other change in dosage of benzodiazepines, non-benzodiazepines, or any other prescription drug should only be done under the direct supervision of a licensed physician. Our full disclaimer can be viewed on our website at benzofree.org/disclaimer.
And